Hi, I'm Shanalika, and it's been a minute. I know practically every video that I make begins with some sort of apology or disclaimer for why I've not been around, but 2024 has been literal hell. Honestly, this year, if I can remember just, to do things like eat, then I'm doing okay. Things do seem to have finally calmed down a bit, and I managed to release a video, so that's good. One that's going to get me lots of hate on the internet. I don't know why I'm saying that, it's weird. This is what I do, you know the drill. I've actually already discussed this topic in a previous video. At the time, I'd wanted to do a casual, unscripted chat, mostly on account of having just had major surgery and wanting to do something easy that we could definitely talk about easily. However, this subject has continued to annoy me to the point that an essay started writing itself before I could convince myself that I don't actually enjoy being yelled at by random people. One of the things that discouraged me from making this video is that in order to understand it, you need to understand systemic racism. In short, that racism is not a trait exclusive to those who hold conscious racist beliefs, but a system we are all raised in and subconsciously perpetuate by default, making it everyone's responsibility to combat, not only in the wider world, but also within ourselves. And most people don't have that understanding, ergo systemic racism exists. But explaining that is a whole other video or three's worth of work. And I don't want to do that because other people have done it already. So if you consider yourself not racist, please engage with some of the following content before watching this. And yes, I did mean to say all of those words and in that order. Why I'm no longer talking to white people about race by Rennie Edo-Lodge is accessible, comprehensive, and informative enough that I, as a person who experiences racism, learned a great deal from it and believe that reading it made me a better person. It's an excellent primer not just for understanding racial power dynamics, but oppressive structures in general. I struggled a bit about YouTube 101s because most of the stuff that I would watch is not 101 level, and I don't want to sit through a lot of those to work out which ones are good. So instead, I'm just going to point you to a bunch of YouTubers who I know make good videos on race, including but not limited to Anansi's Library, Professor Flowers, Princess Weeks, Yara Zaid, T-Noir, The One Janitor, and Khadijah, all of whom are excellent in general, not just as race educators, but they're great for that. I will link to specific videos by other YouTubers that go in more depth on subjects that I touch on as we go along. Some people are going to find it patronizing or annoying that I'm saying this, but the truth is that engaging with more specific content on oppressive systems without knowing how those systems work is no different to marching into a lecture on modal interchange without knowing how to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Before we begin, a note on terminology. I'm personally not a huge fan of the term people of color, for a bunch of reasons that I can't be bothered to explain, but it's the most commonly used term, so for this video I'll be using it interchangeably with the more accurate term racialized people. And as for the ways I'll be using the term goth and various terms relating to it, well, that's going to be our entire first section. Over and over again, you're going to hear people insisting that goth is a music-based subculture. And I am just gonna put my head on the chopping block now and say that, it's not. While music was absolutely central to the subculture's formation in the 70s, the identity today is not limited to nor authenticated by musical tastes. Were that the case, goth aesthetics and themes would not be recognizable in isolation. But people bicker about this a lot, at least as far as I can tell. When I first peered into the online goth subculture many years ago, I found nothing but a mouldering cesspit in which individuals spend all their time arguing about who and what is or isn't goth. Today, the most popular goth content seems to consist primarily of outfit, hair and makeup tutorials and reviews, hauls and unboxing, casual vlogs, responding to comments, reacting to internet drama, and yep, discourse about what is and isn't goth from both sides of the gate. Evergreen content, most of which I don't find particularly interesting. And in all fairness, much of this is just the nature of the internet. People are more aggressive and reactive when they can reduce human beings to usernames, and tend to care about things that they wouldn't if they went outside. In real life, I haven't found alternative people to be this restrictive and exclusionary, or at the very least not so vocally so. Unfortunately, this is a video on the internet, which could be said for any of my videos. So I need to justify my broader definition. To me, if someone says they're Goth, they're Goth. It's not for me to tell other people how to identify, nor important enough for me to care. But I do find it interesting to observe who does and doesn't consider themselves Goth, and why that might be. From what I have observed, Goths tend to self-identify on the basis of one or more of three equally important codifying characteristics, which can be broadly broken down into music, aesthetic, and sensibility. While having stylistic influences stretching back centuries and across the world, it's generally accepted that the Goth subculture as we know it today grew roots in the post-punk offshoot of the UK punk scene in the 70s. As Leela Taylor puts it in Darkly, Blackness in America's Gothic Soul, the style of post-punk was more introspective and cerebral, while sharing aesthetic similarities with the energetic and aggressive punk genre.
As the style became intensified and romanticized, a Gothic predilection for the dreadful and macabre emerged. Susie Sue, who began her career as a Gothic doyenne in the Sex Pistols scene, helped to popularize a look characterized by deathly pallor, dark makeup, Weimar-era decadence, and Nazi chic.
Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it.
Punk's ethos, its militant anti-sexual anarchy, was challenged by the Gothic's romantic obsessions with death, darkness, and perverse sexuality.
These qualities of the Goth subculture were reflected in its associated bands and genres, the credentials of which people have not stopped arguing about to this day. The constant argument about what is and isn't Goth music reflects on just how poorly defined the genre actually is. Very few people would argue that, for example, Slayer isn't metal. You could make the case that it's very hard rock, but why would you? Metalheads absolutely have their own purity debates, for sure, but the core elements of the genre are defined enough to render the validity of some bands pretty indisputable. This is not the case with Goth, like at all. Particularly for newer acts, but even when you drill down to the most influential bands on the subculture as a whole. Literally every band that can be considered Goth can and will also be considered just something else. Bauhaus, Joy Division, Susie Sue, and The Cure are just post-punk, just new wave, or just alternative rock. The closest you can get to a genre here is Gothic rock, which is basically a little club for these bands specifically who share aesthetic similarities but actually sound quite different to each other, blurring the parameters for this as the basis of a musical genre. The waters are then further muddied by the fact that unlike metal bands who, as far as I'm aware, started using the term for themselves as soon as it was in use, I mean, who wouldn't, it sounds cool, several of those who are today considered pioneers of Goth rejected the label outright at the time, including Susie Sue and Robert Smith. Even today, acts rarely use that word for themselves. It's a lot more common to see it in use by fans and reviewers. Agatha is shitposting here, but as a musical genre, the statement Goth's music does not exist is actually true, because as we've seen, the parameters are so vague that there is little clear consensus on what exactly they are. So maybe a better way to use the word is as a descriptor of and of the qualities of music that Goths are likely to be drawn to, rather than as a distinct genre in and of itself. So far, I found this to be the most realistic and the most frequent real-world usage of the term. For the purposes of this video, when I refer to Goth music, I'm not using it to mean any one genre, but as a catch-all term for a variety of genres that relate closely to the subculture. When I refer to Goth, I am referring to the subculture and to those who identify into it. And as for the word Gothic, we are not going to go into exactly what that means and how it differs from Goth. We don't have time. Today, I'm going to be using the term Gothic broadly to describe a Goth-like quality, Gothic, if you will, whether or not the thing I'm describing would fall cleanly into the Goth box, wherever and whatever the hell that is. That's not how everyone uses these words, but that is what makes the most sense to me, and that's what I'm doing for this video. And if you don't like it, you can die miserable, which is admittedly what probably half of you were planning on doing anyway. Example genres that may fall into Goth music might include metal, industrial, post-punk, dark wave, synth pop, alternative pop, and EBM. Any of these might be Goth, or might not, typically on the basis of how their musical qualities pertain to their thematic and aesthetic ones. And that's because non-musical factors are highly important in creating and signifying Goth. The aesthetic, in its most basic form, is something we're all able to imagine fairly instantly. All black clothing, black hair and makeup, very pale skin, put a pin in that, and extreme aesthetic choices such as tattoos, piercings, body modifications, all of which derive from the punk movement of the 70s. In the decades that followed, the goth aesthetic saw frequent incorporation of Victorian elements in imitation of antiquated models of upper-class nobility. Put a pin in that as well. We're putting lots of pins in this video and you're going to get a very special box at the end. Maybe it'll have goth in it. Although the basic template for goth is fairly recognisable, today there are 1,000 wildly different and diverse offshoots ranging from steampunk to pastels. To me, the fact that you can get one person who looks like they're about to raid a shipping vessel next to another who looks like a cake decoration, and that sometimes they're the same person on different days, is one of the most appealing things about it. What unites these wildly varying aesthetics under the goth umbrella is that the presentation reflects on something spooky. Look, this is the trickiest part of it to explain. Sensibility is the word that Vlad used in the other video, and it's honestly the best way that I can think of to describe it. Goth sensibility tends to involve a level of preoccupation with dark, morbid, or violent themes including monstrosity, mortality, the grotesque, and the transgression of boundaries, including deviant sexuality, meaning that the scene is populated by a good number of polyamorous kinky queers. Permeating goth is a theatrical extravagance that frequently tips over into something like pantomime. The exaggerated emotive performance of drag or burlesque is reflected in goth casual dress. Clown or mime-influenced aesthetics are common, as well as outfits so wildly impractical that it takes an hour to get in and out of them. Goths gravitate towards absurdism and camp, and the kind of tongue-in-cheek, self-deprecating humour best demonstrated by the lyrics of the Smiths. In Goth's Undead Subculture, a collection of essays collected by Michael Bibby, among those acknowledged in the intro are individuals by the name of Slutboy and Count von Sexbad. Lebanon and Hanover want you to kiss them until their lips fall off. Sopra Eternus thinks that some men are like chocolate, but others are more like shit. And London After Midnight accidentally killed someone by having the sex be too good. This is a stupid fucking subculture. And most goths I know don't take it as seriously as those who are outside the subculture and only really see this kind of ornate and standoffish exterior seem to think. To me, humour is part of the identity's core, and based on the sheer number of goths I've seen demonstrating or referencing this, a lot of people feel the same way. There is deliberate absurdism in the melodrama. It is ridiculous, that's the point. There's one particular description of the subculture as a whole that I think especially nails it, which has been reposted in so many places that I can't actually be 100% sure of the original source, but I think is the Fashion Gothic blog from 2010.
Goths are not usually supportive of violence, but are tolerant of alternative lifestyles that incorporate themes such as BDSM, always involving consent. The ideology is formed in part by recognition, identification, and grief over societal and personal evils that the mainstream culture wishes to ignore or forget. The subculture is marked by its emphasis on individualism, tolerance for diversity, a strong emphasis on creativity, tendency towards intellectualism, and a mild tendency towards cynicism. But even these ideas are not universal to all goths.
I love that bit, I felt so attacked.
The impediment to explicitly defining a gothic ideology is goth's generally apolitical nature. Goth ideology is based far more on aesthetics and simplified ethics than politics. Goth presents a very different challenge to mainstream norms than does a deliberately lumpen subculture such as punk. Indeed, one might question whether goth constitutes any sort of challenge at all.
According to an attendee at the time, quoted in Goth's Undead Subculture, the Batcave nightclub of the 80s was characterised by the more dressy end of punk, those newly out of the closet fetish scene, and a bunch of gay guys who'd heard that this was the safe place to be. Goth's most genuine and consistent transgression is in its attitude towards sex and gender. Present in punk, and solidifying into a pillar of goth, the acceptance and inclusion of deviant sexualities and practices formed the perfect space for kinksters and queers. Under enough makeup and latex, nobody can make out what gender you are, and furthermore, few care enough to try. Many go further and appear deliberately monstrous or alien, deviating not just from gender conventions, but those of humanity itself. This is a scene where freakishness is not just tolerated, but celebrated. Further to the inherited ethos of inclusion, the tendencies towards melancholy, introspection, and romance have feminine association, as, for that matter, does putting effort into one's appearance. Goths of all genders might paint their nails, wear makeup, and dress in clothes that may or may not correspond to the gender performance expected of them by wider society. The diminishing of visual and behavioural difference between genders, alongside the higher queer presence, seems to have had a lasting effect on the social conventions of the scene. When I went to a goth night with my sister, who is not a goth, she reflected on how unusually safe she felt there. Nobody leered at her in an uncomfortable way or tried to grope her on her way to the bathroom. To which my initial response was, what kind of club nights are you going to? But then I remembered the answer is ones that aren't specifically alternative or queer. Women seem to occupy a higher percentage of roles of presence and authority in goth spaces than in, for example, metal. I find that I regularly come across female musicians without having to actively hunt for them, they just show up. There's also a lot more gender flipping in terms of the roles that musicians might occupy, with men coming forward to the more emotive role of vocalist, and women shifting back into the more intellectual role of instrumentalist, a trend that has existed since the post-punk era and continues today. It's very far from 50-50, of course, but it's still a departure from the extreme gender inequality across the entire rest of the industry. There's not really any of this female-fronted stuff that you get in metal. In goth spaces, female performers are more of a natural part of the fabric than an especially notable selling point. It's unclear whether queer people created the gender fluidity of the scene, or if they gravitated towards it for that reason. Most likely both, but either way, it created a self-enforcing feedback loop that renders the goth scene, on the whole, quite safe and welcoming to women, gay, and trans people. I wish I could say the same about race. In person, I personally have not received overt racist hostility from white goths. That is, things like being told that I don't belong or being called slurs. As always, online is a very different story. There are not many videos on this, but from those I could find, white goths tend to react with horror upon hearing about the racism within the scene and strongly disavow it.
I thought, in my head, that people, cultures, were separated culturally by music. And what I mean by that is that white people, you either listen to country, rock, rap, R&B. Hispanic, you listen to a lot of Latin music. And if you were black, you listen to rap and R&B solely. And it was weird because the white people were like the queen on the chessboard. They can go in any direction.
Oh, that's facts. White people, they can go wherever they want.
This was the summer before my very first year of high school. I was 14 years old and I was ignorant, but not in the racist sense, but in the uncultured way you'd expect from a 14-year-old. So despite going in there with no preconceived notions or expectations, as it turns out, I had one all along, subconsciously, that I was completely unaware of. I realized it when I walked into the main room and saw a sea of faces in every color. My 14-year-old brain went when I saw black faces in the crowd, because everything that I'd known up to that point, I expected to walk in that room and see nothing but white faces.
Guys, she's getting so close to getting it. You can do it. I believe in you.
It was then at that very moment that I unlearned the notion that music separates us by race.
Okay. Well, it was close. I guess at least you learned something.
Music doesn't separate races. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It brings us all together. Everyone was welcome and everybody had this sort of demeanor where they truly felt comfortable. You can just look at them and see that they felt like they were in their element, they were comfortable, they were home, and they were amongst their tribe. There was no tension, no prejudice, just a bunch of kids dressing the way that they want, hanging out with the people that they want to hang out with, listening to the music that they want to hear. The message that I want to impart is Black Lives Matter. Goth doesn't have a color, and racists are posers.
Guys, at the time I'm releasing this, this is the most popular video that exists on the subject of racism and goth. This is the average level of understanding that we're working with. Now you know why I had to do that Racism 101 redirect at the beginning.
People who are misinformed about what goth is, maybe perhaps don't understand that goth is for everyone, no matter what their race is. So I think if a white goth is discriminating against them, it may be because they are a baby bat who's just getting into the subculture. But if it is anyone older, that I think they are being pathetic.
Well-intentioned white goths tend to respond to slur slinging by shunning the racists, by assuring those affected that the whole scene isn't like that, and encouraging us not to let a few individual people spoil our fun. And were that the full extent of the problem, this assertion might be worth something. But the reality is, overt racism isn't when racism happens. That's just when white people can see it. By the time we've got to slurs, the problem is already so much worse than you could possibly imagine, and calling people posers isn't gonna do fuck all about it. Whiteness, not white people as individuals, but whiteness as a social construction, is an oppressive social force that built and maintains the system we live in, benefiting white people at non-white people's expense. It continues to exert itself through unconscious means so subtle that for the most part, neither oppressor nor oppressee realizes that it's happening. That's the whole point. That's how it works. And the whiter the space, the greater the force it exerts. If you go into a space expecting to see no brown people, the fact that there's any at all can make it seem like there are many more than there actually are. Angelina's sea of diverse faces could have been like 5 brown people. Now, to be fair, I know absolutely nothing about the demographics of the New York goth scene in 1994. It's entirely possible that it was as diverse as her anecdote suggests. But from my own experiences, and from what I can gather from anecdotes from racialized goths around the world, that would make it very much the exception rather than the rule. After all, if brown goths really were so normal, she'd never have had reason to make that video. In my experience so far in alternative spaces in the UK, I would estimate visibly racialized people to make up between 1 and 5%, the latter being a rarity seen only in highly diverse cities. In fact, my sister's main other remark about the night we went to was to express surprise at how white it was, and that club was in London. And I was having a great time. I was like, whoa, I've seen like 7 people of colour, this is insane. Dollskill would never have released this infamous slogan, angrily disavowed across the board, easy clicks and virtue points for white goths everywhere, if it wasn't hitting on something true. Brown skin simply doesn't read goths on an intrinsic automatic level. White goths can just wear black, dye their hair and be done with it. Brown goths need to try several times as hard for the same ease of recognition. Part of this is just historical. The majority of the goth movement developed in the UK, primarily among white people, making it primarily a white subculture. Consequently, the architecture, scenery and symbolism associated with goth is European. Creaky castles, abandoned mansions, foggy graveyards, witches performing rites that vaguely hint at paganism or distortions of Christianity. Although goths draws plenty from non-European cultures, put a pin in that, it never does so to the extent that it departs entirely from a fundamental Europeanness. Anything that entirely does, people, practices, locations, symbolism, and iconography, regardless of how fucking creepy it is, does not read goths. And from this, we can see that Europeanness, and by extension, whiteness, is central to codifying what goth is. Now, I'm not obviously saying that that's how it should be, nor, obviously, that racialized people can't be goths. Not least because after hundreds of years of ongoing structural oppression, we are entitled to literally anything white people have. But realistically, this is what we're working with. Goth is fucking white. And just choosing to believe otherwise is idealistic bullshit that doesn't help solve the problem. I have come across the repeated adage that the original scene in the 70s wasn't like this. That, yes, it was primarily white, but its ethos was specifically inclusive. The emphasis on Pallor wasn't codified in the same way, and that racialized people were very much present. It wasn't this weird whites-only club that it often feels like today. Some white goths lament the loss of this past and argue that the idea of goth as a specifically white thing has come out of the mainstreaming and commodification of goth by corporate entities rather than the subculture itself. And that may well be true. I don't know, I wasn't there. But I'm not sure how much it matters. For one, brands wouldn't have capitalized on any particular look if it wasn't gaining substantial traction and recognition to begin with. And two, even if it's not the fault of the scene has been affected, and the white goth ideal and overwhelming whiteness of goth spaces is what we need to deal with today. Like most alternative people, I was a highly bullied child. This happened throughout primary school, but in high school my luck changed. Falling through the social strata meant landing in a bunch of other freaks. With classic gothic self-deprecation, we referred to ourselves as the rejects. By virtue of being a group, especially one who almost pridefully reclaimed our uncoolness, we were no longer easy targets, and as a result, I felt fewer of the effects of social ostracization. Although not as entirely without social rules as I would have liked, the rejects had far fewer than the cool kids, and there was greater room for individual expression. There was a lot of heavy eyeliner and experimentation with sexuality across genders, and obviously we all loved My Chemical Romance. My first concert ever was My Chemical Romance during their Black Parade era, which doesn't have anything to do with the video, that's just a flex. The dominant aesthetic was emo, but goth, punk, and scene, a kind of neon precursor to the pastel goth aesthetics of today, were also present. So I was busy getting into rock and metal and doing the time warp again and developing a taste for misery and women. However, the goth identity, or any of the alternative identities floating around at the time, never felt like something I was able to claim. And this is, retrospectively, in large part due to the scene's obsession with Pallor.
I'd look at the photos of my idols and smash hits, and my white friends with their vampiric pale skin, and I will admit that I was sometimes envious at how effortlessly they could present as goth. Mark Fisher called Susie Sue's look a replicable cosmetic mask, a form of white tribalism. Whiteness was never something I aspired to, but I considered myself a member of this tribe, and that mask never fit me.
Pale skin is referenced constantly in goth music, the complexion of every goth icon, fictional or real. It used to be that you couldn't image search goth without solely getting white faces. Post 2020, there are a handful of black goths, but on clicking through to the sources, we find these images tend to be specifically from articles about being goth and black, rather than articles that are just to do with goth in general. Similarly, it was only post 2020 that alternative clothing brands started to consistently hire racialized models. Even then, I do see a kind of tick box thing going on much of the time where it's like, yep, 2 black, 1 East Asian, we're diverse. I did a serious double take here on seeing someone who looks of Arab or Desi descent, and even then it's only the biggest brands doing this, so Dolls Kill, Killstar and Disturbia. The rest are still this. And yeah, again, that's brands, we're not looking to them for ethics, they will do whatever is profitable. That said, it is preferable that even the mainstream idea of goth shifts away from mandatory whiteness, as this allows more racialized people to see themselves reflected in that idea and then go on to take up space in the scene. And as we discussed earlier, the mainstream face of goth is very much influenced by goth spaces in real life, and the people who are chosen to represent it. There are several reasons for goth's connection to Pallor, and none of them are originally to do with race. Let's start with the most extreme versions of this, clown white and corpse paint. Covering the entire face in pure white and then decorating it with exaggerated features in red or black is a common look in goth and associated scenes. Aesthetically, extreme contrast allows for visual clarity even from a distance, so white masks or paint with black detailing have been in use in performances in various cultures around the world for centuries. Early goth drew from the styles of clowns, mimes, and kabuki to create a mask-like exterior. Whiteface, that is the makeup style that has been practiced by clowns and other performance artists for hundreds of years, has few intrinsic racial connotations. However, when brown people do it, they are frequently assumed to be white or told that they are trying to be, even though no white person naturally looks like this. Meaning, the association between white as a colour and racial whiteness is pretty heavily culturally embedded. But even in the absence of literal white paint, Pallor is central to the stereotypical goth look. Pale-skinned goths might wear foundation several shades lighter than their skin tone and avoid going out in the sunlight for fear of getting a tan. And if asked, the reason that most goths will give you is not that they're trying to look white, but that they're trying to look dead. There is nothing inherently racist in this either. But what the deathly pale stereotype doesn't take into account is that brown people don't really go paler when we die. We actually tend to take on a kind of purplish bruised look, and imitating that, incidentally, is the way to achieve a death-like experience if you're a brown person who's struggling to look dead. On the list of sentences I never thought I would say. Most of the time it doesn't really involve going paler at all. Of course, it makes sense for a predominantly white bunch of people to wear makeup that makes sense for their skin tones. Frankly, it makes a nice change. But the image of goth itself, coming from the notion that pallor equals death, only reflects the experience of those who are already pale-skinned rather than one that is universal. And there are some other qualities paleness aspires to that might be less obvious and less palatable to both viewer and participant. A key difference between goth and punk is class. not necessarily that of the participants, but that evoked by the scene's aesthetics. While punk remained continuously rebellious, deliberately provocative, and unapologetically working class, Goths largely shed this association, becoming delicate, refined, and archly apolitical in a decidedly middle-class manner.
Like the 18th and 19th century Gothic literature from which the term derives, Goth offers a critique of bourgeois culture which originates within the very heart of the bourgeois. Romantic poets, pre-Raphaelite painters, vampire aristocrats, and decadent aesthetes are among the subculture's most hallowed icons. The attention to Gothic rock lyrics, the production and reading of fanzines and websites, the focus on canonical and avant-garde Gothic writing, all point to a subculture with perhaps unprecedented investment in its own literariness.
While there are 1,000 aesthetic variations, one of the most recognisable and classic Goth looks is influenced by Victorian fashion, specifically those of the extreme upper classes, evoking malnourished maidens withering away from consumption. Since the upper classes of today no longer dress remotely like this, the visual isn't so much literal aspiration as deliberate anachronism. Bibby doesn't go into what the critique is exactly, but he might be referring to the juxtaposition of theatrical opulence against a backdrop of the drab everyday, signalling a removal of the former from the latter that doesn't functionally exist. Ruffs and puffs may now be obtained cheaply and easily, in sharp contrast to the wealth that they once would have signalled. But perhaps the visual of ostentatious luxury more accurately reflects the entirety of Western society rather than just its upper classes, one in which the garments of the haves continue to be made by the have-nots. In resurrecting archaic overlords, Gothic opulence comments on the cheap luxury of entire upper-class countries dressed and fed by the labourers of the Third World. Of course, this is me making observations, not a point the subculture is specifically trying to endorse or subvert. While Goths might put more thought into why they dress the way they do than most, an inevitable side effect of having those choices constantly be challenged, I don't think it usually goes this deep. After all, that's getting into uncomfortably political territory. Individual Goths, therefore, are not necessarily alert to the values and associations already internalized by whiteness that Goth serves to exacerbate. Although now inextricable from racism, the association of paleness with superiority, i.e., colorism, is a worldwide phenomenon that predates the modern invention of race. Pale skin signals a life spent indoors, in contrast to manual labourers who would work under the sun. A sheltered, educated upbringing leads to further associations of pallor with fragility, innocence, and intelligence, all qualities that Goth identifies with to some degree. There is obviously no personality that applies to all Goths, but I think we, at the very least, tend to see ourselves as some combination of introspective, sensitive, well-mannered, academic, and artistic, which results in a certain degree of superiority complex, and maybe that's part of what makes Goths so prone to irritating elitism. And don't fucking deny it, you're watching this video and I know full well that it is the most pretentious one I've ever made. Thanks to all this, Goths are highly bullyable. If there is one emotion that unites us, it's probably the feeling of being hard done by in some form or another. And for most of us, this is a reflection of lived experience. Goths provides a way to process abuse as much as an excuse for others to inflict it. But on the more sinister side of things, this identification with victimhood ties into incel-type logic, and the violent behaviours that gave alternative dressers a bad rep during the 90s, and the simultaneous depiction of Goths as dangerous troublemakers in media. Of course, the Columbine moral panic is retrospectively known for putting the blame in the wrong place, on the music that some individuals may have gravitated towards rather than the systems that led them to develop those feelings of isolation and hatred to begin with. As Marilyn Manson put it at the time, dark music tends to function more as a way of processing and moving through difficult feelings than it is a motivator to act violently on them, and I think we've now reached the point where you can do a drinking game for every time I mention Marilyn Manson in a video. There isn't any particular link between dark aesthetics and sudden, unexpected outbursts of violence. Today, Goths are probably better known for being socially awkward vegans than dangerously embittered hooligans. However, there is a clear link between the identification with victimhood present in Goth and that of white supremacy. Over and over again, we are fed the association of white skin with innocence and vulnerability. If a character is meant to be in some way pure and untarnished, the odds of their being imagined as pale, usually also blonde-haired and blue-eyed, are very high. A relatively recent example of the persistence of this association was the backlash against the casting of a black actor to play Rue in the Hunger Games. Despite being described as dark-skinned in the books, many people simply ignored that description because they couldn't Imagine a character who is sweet and innocent and also black. By contrast, dark skin has connotations of coarseness, aggression, and the inability to suffer. This was used to justify the brutalizing and torture of black people during slavery, and continues to come up in a plethora of horrendous ways, from the sexualization of black children to the extremely well-documented medical biases resulting in black people being given less treatment for the same ailments and their accounts of their own pain being disbelieved. As just one particularly horrifying example, black people currently die at 5 times the rate of white people during or after childbirth in the UK. If this is news to you, there's a Khadija video for you in the corner. Please go watch it. All of this demonstrates a reality that has been and continues to be one of dark people suffering at pale hands. The completely backwards notion of any connection between paleness and innocence serves to shield white people from a reality that is very much the opposite. Whenever a white person is so much as mildly inconvenienced by someone racialized, they can only too easily paint them as an aggressor and fall back into the role of innocent victim, and in so doing, exert the structural power of white supremacy. One of the best known recent examples of this was the attempt made by Amy Cooper, a white woman who called the police saying she was being threatened by a black man, specifying that he was a black man, after he requested that she put her dog on a leash in May 2020. In this particular instance, because the attempt was filmed and went viral, it didn't work. But Cooper did this because she knew, consciously or subconsciously, that under other circumstances it would have. White distress, especially white female distress, is prioritized and responded to over that of other races. This is something that white people weaponize constantly by responding to questions, requests, or observations about their behavior by racialized people with overblown distress, putting the onus back on the aggressor to then comfort and reassure that person, instead of dealing with the feeling that they're having and considering their behavior like an adult human being.
It's important for us to really look at what book is going to have Canada open their eyes to what is happening on today. And yes, we celebrate and we heal and we kumbaya and we light.
But Julie, what about what's happening with ourselves? I mean, this is the yeah, we've got to change the world, but people are really, there are a lot of like screwed up people in the world.
There's a lot of colonial privilege.
There's a lot of people happening. That really
this
need,
room
right?
excluded, of course.
And
this
so,
studio excluded.
Yeah,
and
there's a lot of people that have to work on themselves. I mean, when we
there's
see
a lot
people
of people
who
who sit in their cottages in their homes and don't have an experience like others and think that it's, well, you know, let me swipe my Visa card and make a donation, but I don't live this experience. What are we doing to change the current circumstances? We just had a Pope say he's not saying I'm sorry to Indigenous Canadians when he said that in 2015. It is happening right now.
I'm not saying
it's got to change. Yes, we forgive. I believe in Jesus.
But why
do unto
are you
others as we shall do unto
Julie?
you.
Why are you attacking me? No, I totally get what you're saying, and I have.
Hold on, we're live right now.
now.
Why are you attacking me?
I'm not attacking.
The truth hurts. I didn't say anything to attack you, Jeannie Becker. I said nothing about Jeannie Becker.
No, I'm just saying I
say anything about Jeannie Becker?
I just feel that you're speaking to me like I don't believe that. I totally get what you're saying.
Let me tell you what you just said. I feel like. So whatever you're feeling, take it to the altar, because I'm not the one that's responsible for your feelings.
Literally every brown person I have ever spoken to has had some version of this happen to them. It is rampant. There are few things more powerful than a white woman's tears. So, let's say you're a white Goth frequenting a space. It's very easy to, for example, respond to a black person lightly questioning your stance on cultural appropriation by yelling that you're not racist and getting your friends to dogpile that person on social media, including the event organizer who will staunchly defend you while claiming 10 plus years of anti-racist work. Even more hopelessly outnumbered than usual, the non-whites will either back down or leave, leaving you free to do as you please, safe in the knowledge that you were an innocent victim, needlessly attacked by irrational people who just so happen to be black. This is just one of the racist incidents that happened at an alternative night in my city, which is still run by the same people with the same claims to anti-racist work. The bookish and sensitive, troubled and traumatized white Goths may only experience harm. They are incapable of inflicting it. In identifying with both victimhood and superiority, Goth reinforces an artificial construct designed to uplift and protect whiteness, that on its most extreme end loops right round to the ideologies of fascism. fascism. Since 2017, the hashtag GothRight, alongside Goth nationalism and Goths for Trump, began to be used by Trump-supporting Goths. Now, I am fully aware that the fact that there are some Goths who support Trump means next to nothing. Every group will have individuals from across the political spectrum, even when it makes no sense and actively works against their own interests. That there are Goth Trump supporters, while clearly abnormal enough to get a surprised reaction, is a lot less of a contradiction in terms than Trump supporters who are disabled or transgender.
While individual defiance of social norms was socially risky in the 19th century, today it is far less socially radical. Thus, the significance of Goth subcultural rebellion is limited. The Goth subculture has no pronounced political messages or cries for social activism. Unlike punk, there are few clashes between political affiliation and being Goth.
It's difficult to gather hard data on overall Goth political leanings. This is a very niche topic, but from the general tendencies and values of the scene we've discussed so far and some very limited hard evidence, Goths seem to generally lean towards the left. However, what's important to understand is that within this scene, those leanings are just that. Leanings. There is no inherent contradiction in terms between being right-wing and being spooky. Unlike anarchist or queer spaces, progressive politics are not integral enough to what Goth is to make right-wingers entirely and indisputably unwelcome. Furthermore, subsets of Goth fashion provide ample opportunity for right-wingers to sneak in under the radar. After all, if engaging with horror is part of what Goth is, well, what's more horrific than fascism? From Susie Sue's swastika armbands to the naming of Joy Division after groups of Jewish women forced into sexual service in concentration camps, to the plethora of industrial bands' military aesthetics, relentless, repetitive rhythms, and samples of Nazi rallies, use of fascist imagery has been present since the beginnings of the punk movement, typically in the name of irony, mockery, and satire. While the most overt fascist iconography has mostly been dropped since Susie's day, the overall inclination towards evoking it remains. Military goth is a recognisable sub-aesthetic of the scene, and as any quick Google search will show you, it can be pretty blatantly fash-coded, and I'm really into it. This does so much for me. Military goth is one of the hottest aesthetics that there is. We are not gonna unpack this right now. Point is, as someone whose values don't especially gel with fascism, this look makes sense to me on an intrinsic level. The evocation of atrocity through reappropriation and subversion can convey progressive messages, provide catharsis to oppressed groups, strip symbols of their power, and annoy the hell out of fascists, as demonstrated by a disappointed attendee of a Bluthage? I'm really sorry to my German viewers. Normally I check how to say words in advance, but I actually didn't with this. They went to a gig.
The audience consisted of a good handful of blatant homosexuals, a couple of ethnic goths, the Nazi memorabilia fetish brigade, some very Jewish looking, and a couple of nationalists in the corner wondering if we were in the right place or not.
In reimagining fascist aesthetics, military goth replicates a function shared by kink: to take what is frightening, dangerous, and damaging and turn it into something ridiculous, enjoyable, and critically safe. Whether it is safe, however, is not always clear, and this is a problem. Not everyone is doing this shit ironically, or even just with the necessary knowledge of what they are doing. And until you know someone, you really can't presume which side of the fence they're on. After all, far from the historical ghosts and fictional monsters evoked by other Gothic styles, the threats and losses of militarized state-sanctioned violence represented by military goths are only too real. This proximity to present-day reality, and by extension, potential to cause actual harm, renders this side of the aesthetic subject to a lot of scrutiny and debate. In the article Goths for Trump, examining this phenomenon, Michael Bibby, an associate professor of English at Shippington University in Pennsylvania, and the co-editor of the 2017 book Goth, Undead Subculture, stated that the online goth and metal communities have always been havens for some of the worst internet trolls. Trump obviously appeals to racist skinhead culture. I think there's been all sorts of strange crossover between metal, punk, goth, and skin subcultures over the years that find common ground over white supremacist tendencies. I considered going into this discourse in more detail, and part of me really wanted to, but it was turning into its own whole other video, which maybe I'll get to one day. So instead, I'll just end this section with an anecdote demonstrating what that ambiguity means on a practical day-to-day level. One time, I was in the train station, and there was this goth, mostly shaved head apart from like a little blib at the back, covered in tattoos, Doc Martens, leather trench coat, flapping around, would not stop swooping up and down the station, and would not stop staring directly at me. And I was just like, I don't know what this means. I don't know what the situation is. I'm not close enough to read what those tattoos say. When everything's an evil font, it could just as easily be fascist dog whistle as a metal band, and I haven't revised my Nazi symbolism lately. That Goth flirting frequently manifests as a long, insolent death stare can be worrying when it could represent an actual desire to kill you. I'm pretty sure I spotted the same individual at a queer club later, so if they are a fascist, they're deep undercover. Most likely, they're not a fascist and would be quite horrified that I had this reaction. But I'm not gonna apologize for it. Don't stare at people in general, and especially not if you look a bit like a fascist! Without some kind of really obvious counteracting political signifier, like a big trans patch or something, with this kind of aesthetic, it's not possible for marginalized people, especially racialized ones, to know that they're safe around you. And that's just something white goths need to bear in mind if they're going for this kind of aesthetic. This is a big part of the reason that I never assume kinship with other alternative people, and have no interest in meeting people solely on that basis. That we both like Depeche Mode doesn't tell me whether or not you believe that I have a right to be in this country. The goths I'm friendly with in real life are queer leftists first. As a brown person, assuming the best of anyone else just isn't safe. Especially not in a subculture that is not politically motivated enough to keep fascists out, the aesthetics of which actively draw some fascists in. At this point, you might be wondering why, if I have so many issues with the subculture, I still consider myself goth. And that's because the issues that I have are to do with the broader scene, not the identity itself. That said, the subculture's race issue was absolutely a deterrent to expressing or claiming the identity more publicly, or being in alternative spaces. Again, I have zero desire to engage with goth spaces online, but I do venture into various alternative spaces in real life in order to attend gigs and dance to music that I like. Subsequently, and this is not over a long time frame, this is like a year, I've had multiple encounters with very pale goths illustrating the extent to which Pallor, on top of being a stereotype that passively excludes people of colour, is actively sought after and uplifted at racialized people's expense. One goth told me a story about how they were walking down some stairs at a club and found themselves accosted by an event organiser who wanted to know if they DJ'd. Upon saying yes, they were instantly offered a performance slot without the organiser knowing whether or not they were any good. When I asked if they'd chase this very generous offer up, their response was, "No, I don't want to chase them. They can chase me." Another goth told me that they were spotted at an event and made a permanent host for it, despite the fact that in their own words, they can't dance, which is a part of the job, an issue that they got around by, not doing it. When I attended one of said events and asked about one of the performers, said host didn't know who that performer was at the event that they were hosting. Both of these people seemed to acknowledge the strangeness of just being given shit out of nowhere, but it was more like, yeah, don't know why that happened, pretty strange, as opposed to like, white privilege, baby, yeah! Which, incidentally, I would have massively preferred. Like, there's no guarantee that just because someone's aware of their privilege that they're doing anything useful with that knowledge, but it's still an essential first step. I have also seen multiple instances of very pale performers who are either, in my opinion, bad at what they're doing, or offering extremely niche, inaccessible music, where I can pretty much guarantee that a brown person simply would not be able to sell the same product. They'd probably be thrown out of the venue and told never to come back. Now, at this point of the video, we've got into personal anecdotes, and that means that some people who are in my circles may be able to take guesses at who I'm talking about. So I want to take a second just for the record to state that none of this is personal. After all, if it wasn't these individuals, it would be other people who are equally melanin deficient. I'm not saying that these individuals did anything wrong, or that they're specifically not deserving of what they've been given. What I am saying is how many talented and hard-working darker people are regularly passed over because of the gothic bias towards Pallor.
As a goth who is Latina, when I was first getting into goth, I got a lot of heat from members of a whole bunch of goth communities online. Subtle racism. Things like, your hair should be straight, and you should be paler. When I became interested in alternative modeling and submitting my pictures on these alternative modeling resources, such as goth websites and goth magazines, and my submission emails were always shot down with, sorry, this isn't what we're looking for at the moment. Even when I tried getting in touch with friends of mine who were acquaintances of the editors of said magazines and everything, I was still turned away. Magazines like Gothic Beauty and online goth communities like Gothic and Amazing feature only one type. Those who are of primarily European descent. Blue or green eyes, pale skin, and slender bodies. No goths of color, no goths of mixed race, no goths of different body types.
What the fuck? What's wrong with her? She's white passing, or at least definitely looks it. In this video, she looks pale. Like, are her eyes the wrong colour? What the fuck? Needless to say, I have never been offered a gig for any reason other than promoters happening to be at my shows, seeing that I'm quite good, and offering me a performance slot on that basis. If I ask for anything, I am typically not even rejected, but flat out ignored. Like, to the point that I've now given up. In my particular case, the triple whammy of disability, neurodivergence, and racialization has just made sustaining that effort impossible. I'd rather just improve the stuff I put online and occasionally put on my own shows for anyone who wants to come, and if promoters want me, they know where I am. And I know people are going to be like, oh, the industry's a tough business, you gotta have a thick skin, otherwise you're not suited for it. And like, firstly, I'm not trying to make it with music. I don't want to play Glastonbury. God knows I couldn't cope with festival toilets. I'm talking extremely small scale, local shows, maybe occasionally supporting touring acts. At most. And secondly, it would be one thing if it was equally like that for everyone, but when I see white people moving through the space with such relative ease that they don't even know the disparity is there, it's a little galling. And then you take someone like Vlad, who, like, I know I keep going on about them, I simp my partner as I fucking ought to. His numbers around here, despite their posts looking like this, despite his talent being this, and this, and this, and this. Contrasted with white gods, who can upload essentially the same post multiple times in a row and get numbers like this. It is incredible to me that the goths I spoke to could be offered shit on the basis of nothing more than looking like images for the goth Wikipedia page and not instantly clock their white privilege in action. And yeah, maybe there was more to it, being friends with organisers, maybe someone got recommended by someone and they didn't tell me about that, blah blah blah. Even then, why does friend pushing primarily work for those whose main qualification is being translucent? Why does that override factors like being good at, or even doing the job that you're being paid to do? But can you imagine if I'd contested this? Like, hey, that's so interesting. Have you considered why it is that you get given shit for, like, existing? That you can just sit back and wait for people to come to you while the rest of us have to beg and plead and sweat and toil to twice the standard for half the recognition for a machine that makes it constantly clear that it doesn't want us, all the while enduring the trauma of existing under a system built on disadvantaging people like us to the benefit of people like you. And in part due to this, we experience higher levels of disability, pain, and sickness, which further impacts our ability to show up. And then when we do, it's harder to be open and friendly because we're always anticipating the next letdown, until eventually it's not worth it, and we leave and you turn around and go, where are all the brown people? Guess they just don't like this music. Have you considered that? Can you imagine if I said that? It doesn't feel terribly safe to bring conversations like this to the table when you're one of two visibly racialized people in a room of about 200. And that is not an exaggeration. It's a fairly standard turnout for alternative events in my city. But the scene's rejection of racialized people doesn't only occur because everyone's so focused on uplifting the white ones. It's an active, if usually subtle, behaviour too. When I did my metal video, I had a whole bunch of people in my comments saying, make a playlist, and I was like, that's a great idea, but I'm deceased, unfortunately, from making the video. So this time, I got on it in advance. Vlad and I made a companion playlist for this video, link in the description. However, we found that if we stuck to the usual kind of parameters for what constitutes goth music, impossibly non-specific as those are, there were so few racialized people that we expanded the playlist from goth to gothic, including music that absolutely invokes the right sort of qualities or themes, but wouldn't automatically be seen as doing so by most goths. That is, white ones.
White youth movements reinvent themselves through arrested encounters with black cultures. One perceives a variation on this dynamic at play in music journalist Simon Price's claim that goth was the first form of rock which couldn't be traced back to rhythm and blues. There is no line connecting Sisters of Mercy to the Mississippi swamps. Instead, the likes of Bauhaus, Sisters, and Sex Gang Children imagine themselves as heirs to both the Wagnerian or Teutonic classical lineage and the Arabic mysticist tradition. His telling description of how goth bands imagine themselves offers a gothic variation on the Arrested Encounter. In claiming a romantic Orientalist genealogy for goth, as distinct from the African roots of rock, Price situates goth as the product of European, rather than United States, cultural and colonial projects.
The audible presence of non-whiteness, blackness specifically, automatically renders music not goth to the average listener. As a result, I find that goths of colour tend to get more creative with their art. They can't, after all, become goth poster children simply by having the correct aesthetic. So why bother trying to fit that mold? Both musically and stylistically, I notice darkly inclined people of colour incorporating influences from a wide range of genres. One of my favourite bands to do this is Algiers. I discovered them in a shop in 2015 on one of those little headphone sampling booths. I remember taking a chance on the album cover and being absolutely knocked out by the song Irony Utility Pretext. Algiers combined industrial and hard rock influences with gospel, creating an absolutely otherworldly and incredibly intense listening experience that utilises gothic sensibility to reflect on a specifically racialized experience. I don't know what a good growth rate is for musicians, or if they were even aspiring to that. Algiers have a decent following now, but this is almost 10 years later, so I don't know how long it took for those changes to occur. All I do know is that they were criminally underrated for years. I personally find this kind of genre creativity really compelling. It lights up my brain in a different way to music where I can predict what's coming next, which also absolutely has its place. Unfortunately, it can result in an already excessively gatekeepy subculture, further rejecting racialized people on more legitimate grounds. As Bibby stated, Sisters of Mercy are heavily influenced by gospel, but you can bet that if black performers did the same thing, their blackness could well override the musical and thematic content. It might well be recast as black music rather than anything close to goth. Not always. Nothing I'm saying is always. These are all social trends and patterns, not laws of physics. Light Asylum are an example of a popular band in the subculture with a black vocalist who sings in a black way. That's a whole other discussion, and other YouTubers have done videos on that. I'm not gonna go there. But they're an exception, and it's worth noting that they're not otherwise deviating too hard. A little bit, for sure, but not too much. Because for racialized people, there is less room for deviation when you're already deviating by being the wrong colour. It would be nice if I could say that the implication that I couldn't be goth only existed when my friends and I were literal children, but that's just not been the case. As I grew older and my connection to goth music grew stronger, white goths would still use the word in a way that clearly excluded me from that definition, even when they knew full well what my music tastes were. Like, you're here with goths, or this is a goth thing, or wow, I'm so goth. The implication always being that present company is not. Another favourite is, you listen to more goth music than I do! With this, tone of amazement, not taking a second to consider why exactly they should find that weird. Another time that really stuck with me was there was this white goth telling somebody else about some blood play they'd been doing, and I just wasn't paying attention for a second, and the next thing I knew I was being directly addressed and they were going, oh, you're so weirded out. Now there are a myriad of reasons I could give as to why I wasn't weirded out by what was essentially an aesthetic blood test. Instead, I'm gonna ask the question, why was I ever pushed into denying a position that it made no fucking sense to assume that I held? There are a lot of behaviours within this subculture that specifically draw attention to gaps in cultural norms, that create and solidify the in-group by virtue of exclusion of the mainstream with their normie opinions and behaviours. It's not necessarily my favourite thing, but it happens. By turning that practice on me, by assuming that my knowledge of goth musical practices could only be surface level, that when it came to the more intense facets of the subculture, I would suddenly become disgusted or horrified, it was revealed that I wasn't truly considered part of that in-group after all. That something about me signaled that I was not and could never become one of them. I wonder what it was. Look, I can't say for certain that every single one of these incidents occurred because of race. I don't have a universe where I'm white to compare with. But there is no doubt in my mind that were I white, there certainly wouldn't have been so many. In isolation, these incidents were confusing and annoying, but not enough to bring up. Doing so would feel petty. None of them really mattered enough. But in aggregate, they show a pattern of subtle credential checking and exclusion that functions to gradually affect a person's sense of identity and belonging. In other words, microaggressions. Active gatekeeping of the Goth scene tends to occur mostly online. In person, I have never had a white Goth call me a slur, or tell me I'm not welcome, or just straight up not Goth. Overt racism isn't required to exclude someone from an identity or a space when the very image of what that identity is excludes non-whites by default. With just the barest of microaggressions and unseen bag stopping, it is easy to tell people that they don't belong without ever once saying it out loud. The constant assumed outsiderness from all white Goths I met had a persistent effect. So, despite listening to a shit ton of Goth music and being highly drawn to themes of horror and grotesque, I continued to not feel like I had any claim to the identity. This changed, of course, after meeting Vlad. Before him, I don't think I'd ever met a Goth of colour. Certainly not one who expresses themselves like Vlad, although that's probably still the case. Seeing them present exactly the way they wanted was emboldening and empowering, and made me feel like I could express myself more freely too. But more than that, almost instantly upon meeting me, Vlad used the word Goth to describe me without me ever asking them to or really expressing that visually at all. I felt seen. And that was everything. My relationship with Vlad has been a huge part of what allowed me to make visible this really quite core part of my identity. In other words, it took until a racialized person saw Goth in me to claim it, because not one white person had ever done so prior. Which is tragic, because Goth makes so much sense for us. There are so many obvious ways that the themes and sensibility relate specifically to the racialized experience that, when you take a step back and think about it, it's nuts that this isn't a scene led by people of colour, especially considering how much the scene loves taking inspiration from racialized people. Heads up, we're about to get into cultural appropriation territory, and I know people are already in the comments with their pre-prepared arguments and justifications. But if you're still listening, I'm not here to tell anyone what they can or can't do. I literally don't have that power, I'm just a person on the internet. What I do want to say is that if you take pretty much any culturally contested aesthetic, you're gonna come across a lot of white people saying it existed in X white culture Y years ago. Whether or not any of those claims have any validity, for the most part, that is not where modern day white people take inspiration for those aesthetics. Dreadlocks were not passed down as ancestral practice among white folk. The notion that there is a white ancestral claim was dug up as justification after white folks started wearing dreadlocks inspired by black people. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm saying whether or not various ethnic cultural signifiers existed in a lineage various white folk may or may not have a claim to, that is not where white people get those symbols from today. That is all I'm saying. If you infer extra information from that, that's your problem. Throughout the 70s and 80s, a wave of Orientalism spread through Western music, with symbols, iconography, and musical features of various cultures incorporated into the works of white artists, including several of the forerunners of Goth, often with little relevance to the material in question. In keeping with what we've discussed already regarding politics, this lifting of symbols and styles from around the world isn't done with much regard as to their meaning or context. It's very common to see a random Ankh in a Goth ensemble, or to hear an incongruous sitar or koto in amongst synths and guitars. But everything we've looked at so far stresses Goth's Europeanness, even to the exclusion of people who aren't quite white enough. So what's this about? Alana Mortlock describes it as the fetishization of the racial other, or what we might think of as the exotic, as a space-time characterized by a kind of hedonism that offers the promise of escapism. The other, as escapism, is epitomized by the kinds of influences Goth takes, specifically in its non-specific-ness. So long as something looks mystical, unusual, or frightening, all qualities intrinsic to the racialized other, it makes sense for Goth. Furthermore, symbols of blackness appeal for their association of rebellion and dissent. Hence, we have an entire subculture that constantly evokes the racialized other without literal representation of those people.
I believe that American culture is obsessed with transgression, and to the degree that blackness remains a primary sign of transgression, one could talk about American culture and mainstream culture as being obsessed with blackness, but it is blackness primarily in a commodified form that can then be possessed, owned, controlled, and shaped by the consumer, and not with an engagement in black culture that might require the one to be a participant and therefore to be in some way transformed by what you are consuming as opposed to being merely a buyer. There's a way in which white culture is perceived as too wonderbread right now. Not edgy enough, not dangerous enough. Let's get some of those endangered species people, to be exotic for us. And it's really simply, I think, a more, upscale version of primitivism.
Cyberlocks are an absolutely standout example of Goth's relationship to the cultures it draws from. Most heavily associated with the cybergoth aesthetic, you remember these guys. Cyberlocks are tubes of synthetic fibres, usually in bright neon colours, that are worn, best as I understand it, as a removable piece of headgear. In amongst this arrangement may also be anything else that's like vaguely hair-shaped, strings of beads, belt straps, LED strips, froobs. By this point, we're not even looking at hair, so we're arguably not looking at dreadlocks. However, as the name cyberlocks would suggest, dreadlocks are the indisputable source of inspiration. Cybergoth as a whole epitomizes Goth's relationship to its racialized influences, becoming something so far removed from its origins to be no longer instantly identifiable as such, while still retaining enough of the racialized other to trigger the same sense of fundamental difference from dominant, white, culture.
Brown and black influences run through the cultural Gothic spectrum. Mexican Dia de los Muertos, Afro-Caribbean hoodoo, and ancient Egyptian symbols of the dead. Goth borrows and samples from the ancient and the archaic, regardless of religion, culture, or ethnicity, but its reputation is that of a black-on-black wardrobe with a tubercular complexion.
In emphasizing aesthetic over substance, Goth strives for an appealing oblivion, a mask with the power to obliterate every other identity beneath it. In theory, who you are and where you come from ceases to matter. The disparate symbols and influences painted onto Goth's white face evoke a non-specific foreignness enough to separate it from the surrounding culture, while Pallor protects against the social punishment of deviation from whiteness itself. Don't get me wrong, white Goths can and do still experience a degree of marginalization, but that marginalization occurs because of how the audaciously flamboyant, culturally non-specific, and androgynous look of Goth is entwined with other marginalized groups. The marginalization of Goths therefore occurs as the result of, for example, racism, sexism, homophobia, rather than any social structure that targets them specifically.
Goth appropriates the symbolic capital of racialized others through romantic strategies of self-invention, avowing and disavowing what it chooses. In this, as in several other respects, Goth is complicit with the normative status of whiteness in mainstream culture.
So as we're having a mounting fascism in the United States that is perpetuated increasingly by liberal, young, moneyed, liberal white people, if they're wearing black clothes or listening to black music, they can be perceived as transgressive, as radical, when in fact, once again, we see a separation between material aspirations and cultural and social interests. So that at any point in time, they can drop their interest in blackness and do whatever they need to do to reinforce their class interests, the interests of white supremacy, the interests of capitalism and imperialism. Pretend that you're going somewhere that you're not really going, and you can stay in place and be ready to serve the state when the state calls you because you really haven't left home.
An upside of Goth's fondness for a light sprinkling of foreign is that it can provide some ways for foreigners of various types to express themselves in ways less available in the mainstream. Goth's emphasis on aesthetic over substance often extends to the music as well as the visuals. When all that the audience really wants is some combination of sad, evil, and sexy, lyrics are of limited significance. You can use your music to say something meaningful, but you really don't have to, because the content is less important than the vibe. I think this is why London After Midnight's political album sucked. Like, clearly their hearts weren't in it. It just made no sense. Like what are you doing? No one asked for this. Go back to talking about your murdered dick! The significance of feel, energy, and aesthetic over lyrical content is further evidenced by bands such as the Cocteau Twins, whose lyrics are literally incomprehensible. Vocals are often relatively low in the mix and drowned in effects and reverb. And on the more industrial side of things, while there's often more clarity to the vocal production and lyrics, from my British perspective, I see a lot of listeners who don't speak German listening to a great deal of German music. Goth genres therefore provide opportunities for popularity with English-speaking audiences without the requirement to write in English. The experimental darkwave band Short Paris performs in Russian and French, while the dark trap scene has an immense pool of Russian-speaking artists, including I Speak and Igel. This means that even when performing in English, the foreignness of European darkwave bands such as Echo Barrel or Ultra Sun isn't a problem. If anything, the accents and disjointed phrasing that might occur from English as a second language contribute to exactly the kind of non-specific exoticism that Goth tends towards. While it's harder for racialized musicians to gain a foothold in this scene, those that do may find themselves more able to openly embrace their cultures and languages than in mainstream music. And I optimistically think that once this acceptance of foreignness starts to transcend skin colour, there's very real potential here for racialized artists that wouldn't otherwise exist. Current examples include Aurat, who perform mainly in Urdu, often without romanized song titles, and Prayers, who explicitly incorporate their Cholo identity into lyrics performed in both Spanish and English. Prayers are interesting in that a lot of their songs reference not just their racialized identity, but the subculture itself and their relationship to it. One of my favourites is 1913, which goes into the gender expression of the scene. It's basically a heterosexual ally song about the singer's personal relationship to the scene's queerness, but it's also a really affirming banger, and I love the video so much that I shoved it into the metal video as well, so apologies if you've seen these visuals before, except not really, because why would you not want to see this again? One of Prayer's most explicitly race-related songs and videos is Mishika, which begins with an extensive spoken section, and talking about music on YouTube is really annoying because I can't just put this in the video, which would be the logical thing to do right now and completely fair use, but YouTube automatically demonetizes any video with audio it recognizes, and fighting that just isn't worth the effort. If anyone knows any ways around this or has seen other YouTubers discussing music in a different way, please let me know. That'd be useful if I ever want to talk about music again. I'll narrate it instead. The video opens with Dave Pallor walking on screen to kneel beside the body of an indigenous person, the presumed victim of white colonizer violence. The video then shows several shots of a traditional dance form, which I believe is the Mexica stance, which I believe emerged from the traditional conchero stance with the specific aim of eliminating colonial European influence. Caveat, I know fuck all about this. I'm interpreting this in the wider context of colonization in general from an area of the world that has very little in the way of indigenous people or Latin American culture. Apologies if I'm missing any of the nuances of this tradition specifically. The video's in black and white, stripping it of the more festive and jovial associations of colour and lining up more closely with the somber associations of monochromatic goth. The dancers are painted with skulls, evoking both the fearful association of skulls with death and the specific traditions of Dia de los Muertos, defiantly claiming both of those identities as one. The lyrics speak of the indignity of Mexican people being told to leave various parts of the US where indigenous people occupied the whole continent prior to white invasion. It then goes on to deliberately embody the fear of the racialized other. Unapologetically threatening, the lyrics provoke notions of tribal primitivism used as justification for the atrocities committed by white people, while at the same time offering a sense of pride and solace to the descendants of this same violence and acknowledgement of the lives and culture lost. Mishika, and much of Prayer's music, is a middle finger to whiteness in a manner made specifically possible through Goth's music and visuals.
The word spook comes from the Dutch spook, meaning ghost or apparition. In the 1940s, spook became a word for spy, a clandestine, sneaky person whose life is in the shadows. About the same time, spook also became a derogatory word for black people. The Tuskegee Airmen, the group of black Air Force fighter pilots and bombers during World War II, were even referred to disparagingly as the Spookwaffe.
The otherness that is integral to and deliberately manifested by Goth already exists in racialized people, exists regardless of taste in fashion or music. Racialized people in Western countries are here largely as the direct or secondary result of white colonization of their countries of origin. Connections to culture and language are weakened first by that initial wave of displacement, and in subsequent generations, further eroded or severed entirely. The primary result of white directives towards the indentured or enslaved, and the secondary result of immigrant parents attempting to whitewash their children to better fit Western society. But the visual separation of brown skin, and every notion that goes with it, renders true assimilation an impossibility, while the deprivation of language and culture renders those same individuals equally and irreparably divorced from the birthplace of their parents or grandparents. For those of us of mixed or displaced descent, for whom a sense of belonging is never a given, there is solace under Goth's veil of patchwork cultural mismatch. Not to replace lost cultures in history, as many white Goths might prefer, but to recognise, represent, and reckon with that very loss. With black as the traditional mourning colour in Western culture, and Goth's propensity towards melancholy and graveyards, Goth can be seen to express a perpetual state of grief. This isn't to say that all of us go around feeling miserable all the time, but that the romanticisation and evocation of loss and suffering is a method of processing, as Fashion Gothic put it, society's evils. And while society's evils, or to use Bell Hook's term, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, do negatively impact everyone, some of us are a great deal more impacted than others. Of course, a subculture that offers connection and catharsis through the immersion and embodiment of grief has particular relevance to the descendants of genocide, colonization, enslavement, and persisting structural oppression. Far from throwing a brocade rug over that violence, Goth provides catharsis through its embodiment.
The lost object is absorbed into the self, and we become simultaneously the mourner and the thing being mourned. A lost home, a lost language, a lost religion, a lost history. When that missing person, place, or thing is so far removed from its original form, so fractured and disseminated, when its existence is denied altogether, that lost object remains unknown and unattended, and absorbed into the self and into the culture.
For the last 3 years running, I've noticed that my favourite novels per year, that is, Bunny, Bloodchild, and The Devourers, have all been works of highly imaginative horror by racialized authors, which is very interesting to me because I wasn't specifically seeking out this combination of genre and identity. The pattern only became apparent after the fact. But that there is a pattern really shouldn't be surprising. The daily experience of existing as a racialized person gives us a unique connection to horror and otherness, allowing these authors to explore these themes with a radical creativity that, frankly, I don't think white people are capable of. Personally, this is how I interpret the lyrics of You and I Are Not the Same by Scary Black. And yes, that name does mean what you think it means, and yes, I had to go lie down for like an hour to recover from just how good it is. Maddeningly, I can't find lyrics for this song anywhere, so I had to re-listen a few times, doing like whatever the ear equivalent is of squinting to see if my initial interpretation from hearing the chorus was along the right lines. And I still can't make out all the lyrics, but I think the message is fairly unambiguous. The exact line between himself and the you mentioned in this song could be drawn in a few places, but I think it's safe to say that white people, white Goths specifically, are among the intended recipients. In 2014, Annie Lennox spoke about her cover of Strange Fruit in a Tavis Talks interview. When discussing the song's themes, she failed to mention that the song is about lynchings, and instead spoke of violence as a human theme that we as human beings have to deal with. Naturally, the interview was heavily slammed at the time and criticised in Leela Taylor's book, which is how I came across it. I couldn't find this interview online, but I did find another interview where she acknowledges the lynchings, but otherwise still doesn't seem to understand why she was criticised.
Of course, it's specifically about the lynchings in the South. This is absolutely the case. It was a response to that specific pre-civil rights movement. But basically, the issue of violence is the issue that is played out, perpetrated 24/7. Constantly. It is the theme of the dark side of humanity, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be racist attacks, whether it be bigotry, hatred, terrorism, or warfare. humankind is constantly at odds with itself.
While all systemic oppression does essentially stem from the same place, which I think is what Lennox is trying to get at here, the various ways and the extent to which different groups are affected vary very drastically. Trying to stretch a theme of violence that is specifically about anti-blackness into one that is universal is to deny the reality and privilege of being totally free of that experience, and is therefore a refusal to actually try to understand that oppression or how to fix it. So this flattening of the experiences of oppressed groups contributes to the perpetuation of that very oppression. This is very much reflected in the desire of many white Goths for you to leave your race at home. This is a space for pretending race doesn't exist. We're all misfits here, we're all the same, we all suffer equally. Unlike many racialized artists in this genre, Scary Black comes about as close to indisputable Goth music as you can get, and I think that might be how he got away with sneaking these call-outs to white Goths under the radar. Listening to his music in a club or at a show, they're mostly not going to realize what's happening, not least because they don't want to. Part of the reason that racialized Goths are dismissed, perceived with caution, or doubly marginalized by white Goths and non-Goths alike is because on us, the aesthetic is more likely to actually mean something. Through a racialized lens, Goth reflects an other beyond white comprehension, signaling genuine disruptive potential.
There's an acceptance of white weirdness, an assumption that there will always be white folks with subcultures and affiliations that rebel against conventional norms and societal expectations. Adding an extra layer of oddity on top of an already marginalized group flies in the face of respectability politics.
Taylor makes the point that chattel slavery demanded a performance of contentment, and black displays of misery and grief are therefore a radical act. This applies to the non-white diaspora more broadly in that while overt cheerfulness isn't necessarily required, you can't be seen to be complaining about your lot in life. After all, you should just be grateful that you get to be here. You're not really supposed to draw attention to yourself, let alone in a fashion that specifically evokes discontent. The additional expectation on brown people to blend in and perform contentment to whiteness renders the refusal to do so doubly transgressive. All the more so when the horrors of whiteness itself are among the grievances we manifest. The mourning specific to Goths of colour isn't just over the generalised evils of humanity, but over those that whiteness has inflicted. Evils that white people, including white Goths, continue to benefit from and perpetuate to this day. Small wonder, then, that we make white Goths uncomfortable.
I'm friends with African American Goths. We're interested in what is in each other's minds and, you know, our interests, not what we look like. The color of skin has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on how they see things or think things or feel things.
Goth is goth. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what colour you are. It's flipping diverse.
There was no tension, no prejudice, just a bunch of kids dressing the way that they want, hanging out with the people that they want to hang out with, listening to the music that they want to hear. And their cup was way too busy overflowing with all of that to even think about bringing race into the equation.
The idea that racism exists in the Goth scene typically doesn't sit well with white Goths. As Danny Buckley, writing for Styled magazine in 2020, lamented,
Goths, sharing little more than their love of the strange and unusual, were unabashed middle fingers to the mainstream and embraced those whose preferences were not the norm. To do the same because of someone's race or lack of pale makeup is not only repulsively racist, but also an insult to everything that the Goth subculture was, is, and spawned from.
I repeatedly come across laments like this, stressing the supposed incongruence of racism with Goth's transgressive origins and intent. And perhaps once Goth identity truly did necessitate values of inclusion and diversity. However, now that the identity has been already codified, the associated spaces already created, the look so clearly defined and instantly accessible, the underlying values need no longer be practiced to lay claim to it. A good example of this is the subculture's relationship to fashion. As Catherine Spooner puts it,
in late 1970s and early 1980s Britain, subcultural style was very much a DIY affair. In the economic recession of the late 1970s, an improvised approach to style became a necessity for many young people. As the economy boomed later in the 1980s, this remained a form of resistance to a mainstream culture that fetishized wealth. In the ongoing spirit of punk, those pursuing alternative style would raid jumble sales and charity shops, recycle army surplus, customize high street fashion, and make their own clothes and accessories accessories.
Starting with Hot Topic in the late 80s and persisting with modern brands such as Killstar and Disturbia, the goth aesthetic is now available for purchase at the drop of the hat, much to the chagrin of many goths who view branded clothing with disdain. I didn't used to understand this because while there are very legitimate ethical reasons to stand against fast fashion, why direct your ire at alternative outlets specifically? Why aren't you equally fussed by people shopping at River Island or Primark? Having given it more thought since, the conclusion I've reached is that the DIY ethos and pride in thrifting, recycling, and customization, inherited from punk, has persisted among the goth social consciousness as a mark of authenticity. The resentment is less at the fact that fast fashion is evil, and more at the fact that any mass-manufactured item being marketed as alternative isn't really alternative at all, which isn't untrue. But why does that matter? Punk's resistance to mainstream fashion came from somewhere. It was a middle finger to mass production, to the exploitation of factory and sweatshop workers in producing these items, to the dehumanization of ourselves as placid, mindless consumers. Punk didn't exist merely in resistance to commercialization, but in the values that underpinned and drove that resistance. It wasn't, at least originally, rebellion just for rebellion's sake. But when goths complain about Killstar, I rarely see ethics or values being mentioned at all. There's an awareness that resisting commercialization is somehow important. There's not that much acknowledgement of why. And truthfully, I'm not sure how many even care, or if caring can be any longer said to be part of what goth is. It's not a question of doing the right thing so much as the goth thing. It's not a question of ethics, it's a question of authenticity. But without underpinning values, what makes that authenticity worth defending? Now, I do get that there are some goths, a lot of goths, who are very concerned with its anti-capitalist roots, who feel a lot of frustration about this and do consider ethics critical to goth identity. However, there are just too many differing aspects and opinions contributing to the notion of what goth is to make that a concrete reality in the wider world. And going around telling people that they're not goths doesn't remotely fix the problem. When I'm in a goth space, I know on a gut level that I'm not supposed to be there, that my presence is unsettling in ways that those present may not be able to articulate or understand. And yeah, maybe some people are looking at me because the goth idea of flirting is doing this from halfway across the room, but it's also very likely because I catch interest, because I stand out, which doubles up when I'm anywhere with another goth of colour. Of course, in Vlad's particular case, I get why people want to look at them. Sometimes I get distracted from what they're saying just because of whatever astonishing thing it is they've done with their face. We've been together for 6 years, you'd think I'd be used to it by now. I'm not, I never will be. But on the other, even they shouldn't be that weird in an ostensibly alternative space. Furthermore, we're not going on the permissive arm of a white person, we're going on each other's. We aren't seeking permission or validation in that space, meaning we might as well be going around holding a giant sign saying fuck you. You know, it's like, hang on, where's your owner? If there are other racialized people at a goth event, I very frequently end up hanging out with them. Like, this happens over and over. And it's not something I do on purpose, it seems to just happen. Probably because we feel safer with each other. And for white goths, witnessing this subgrouping, this minority forming within the minority, creates an even greater sense of unease. Because no matter how much white goths identify with outcasts and misfits, the contrasting presence of racialized people in that space illuminates the uncomfortable dominance of its white majority. It troubles the previously unquestioned identification with victimhood when said victims suddenly realize themselves to be members of a dominant homogeneity, when they understand that the shadowy alternative space that they've carved out for themselves in fact values, uplifts, and rewards the physical traits of an identity that they can't identify out of. And I get it! It's not fun noticing when and how your scene actually replicates the oppressive behaviours it thinks it stands against. Dealing with that requires diligence and effort and bravery. Not dealing with that requires only that people show up and have a good time and maybe occasionally shout Black Lives Matter. White goths have become so committed to the belief that the scene is welcoming and inclusive that they aren't willing to make sure that it is, because that would mean acknowledging that it isn't. So it's no wonder that while adamantly unwilling to reject us outright, many white Goths choose to perform acceptance in an I don't see colour fashion, pushing the idea that Goth identity supersedes all others, virtually eliminating race from the equation. In doing so, they create an additional pressure on racialized people to stay silent on the subject for fear of rocking the boat and sparking the ire of those who are in charge of the fucking space. In reality, the association between whiteness and Goth is so strong that Goths of colour may barely feel able to claim the term, much less show up, knowing full well how much they'll stand out and how many subtle pressures will be exerted on them to leave. And not just subtle ones either. I've only not focused on the more overt examples of racism in this video because I want the non-racist white Goths watching to recognise where that racism exists in themselves. Overt hostility absolutely exists as well, it just mostly isn't the subject of this video. Over and over, racialized Goths are pushed from Goth spaces, choosing instead to relate to their Gothness in isolation or, if they're lucky enough, with each other. And in their absence, white Goths remain blissfully unaware of the scene's issues and do nothing about them. If our absence is noticed at all, it can be chalked down to disinterest and external cultural factors, rather than the issues of the scene itself. In Goth spaces, whiteness may experience a delusion of acceptance and diversity, while witnessing nothing but itself. Which is sad, because the aesthetic and sensibility of Goth blends uniquely and beautifully with the racialized experience, and by losing that, everyone misses out. I'm not necessarily here to say that Goths should be a wildly politically active identity. There is very real value in the escapism that it provides as well. But Goths should, at the very least, understand that without conscious effort, escapism is the best the subculture has to offer, that the aesthetic of dissidence is no substitute for the real thing. I'm not making this video because I hate Goths. Much like the gender and metal video, this is kind of a love letter to the thing I'm critiquing. I rarely feel engaged enough to criticize something I don't care about, and making this video has really highlighted how important a part of my identity Goth actually is. I'm so glad I finally got to the point where I felt able to claim and express it. And it sucks that I have felt and continue to feel, at least to a degree, pushed out of scenes that I would really like to be a part of. Now, I don't want white Goths to all come in my comments like, no, you do belong here, don't worry, and fuck those people who made you feel sad, please bathe in my white validation. I don't want reassurance. I want reparations. I want white Goths to know that the experience of being marginalised does not make it impossible to marginalise others. You have internalised racism like everybody else, and the same responsibility to check it. I want white Goths to question the ways that they relate to Pallor. I want white Goths to understand that the scene specifically venerates them in a manner that permits structural racism to flourish. I want white Goths to know that it's no coincidence that genre policing gatekeeping, combined with the punishment and rejection of deviance, mimics models of fascism, benefiting very few, exclusively white members of the subculture at the detriment of the values it espouses. And I want white Goths to understand that these issues will not go away unless they do something about it. Like what? Well, I'm glad you asked. Just knowing is the first step, so if you made it to the end of this video, genuinely well done. You're on the right track. A lot of this work is internal, and there are automatic positive effects that result just from awareness and critical thinking. But there are a couple of practical steps I want to highlight too. If you're an event organizer, know the barriers faced by people of colour, in general, and especially in this space. Make it clear in your marketing and promo that racism won't be tolerated, including microaggressions. If someone so much as touches someone's hair without permission, that should be grounds to throw that individual out the club. A vague no racism statement isn't clear enough. Offer instructions on exactly what to do and who to go to if you're being made to feel uncomfortable, with the reassurance that that feedback is wanted and will be heard. And I wouldn't have even thought of this next thing if I hadn't seen it in the wild, but offering racialized people cheaper tickets. Yeah, that's a good reparation. I like that one. I've seen one event doing this and it was astonishing in a really good way. What's less surprising is that that particular event is one of the very few I know of that has racialized people on the organizational team. This is also important. Get racialized people involved in running your event and you will find more of them in your club. And make sure they are paid the same amount as everyone else. This sounds obvious, but all too often people of colour are expected to perform additional diversifying labour to meet EDI targets for free. Remember, you're not doing us a favour. You are taking responsibility to counteract the effects of a system and particularities of a space that make it harder for us to do literally anything. Make a specific effort to find and pay racialized dancers, DJs, musicians, drag performers, resident clowns, whatever it is you need. I'm not saying give non-white performers gigs regardless of ability. Honestly, that's a straw man and I'm fed up of hearing it. I'm saying become aware of the bit of your subconscious that quickly and automatically categorizes performers as not a good fit, that loses their messages because you were just too busy, that finds said people inexplicably intimidating, that over and over again conveniently slides away from the sight of brown skin. And yeah, sometimes there's just not gonna be anyone. We're talking about a particularly white subculture within countries that are already white majority. If you're doing your best, then you're doing your best. And you're the only one who can know whether or not you are. If you're a white punter, recognize your privilege in that space specifically, and educate yourself on race issues more broadly. Specifically seek out the work of non-white writers, performers, and artists, and make an effort to share and uplift their voices in the community. Above all, strive to create an environment where racialized people feel comfortable enough to speak. And when they talk, listen. After all, you can only aspire to understand horror without us. When I first started this video, I thought, this is so niche. Like, is it gonna be worth it for 5 minutes of content that 2 people will like? But I ended up having so much more to say about this than I ever could have predicted. If only 2 people like it, hopefully they'll like it a lot. Again, we got that playlist going, link in the description. Do drop your recommendations. Vlad and I will be scouring the comment section. Self-promotion welcome and encouraged. I want to hear your shit. Oh wait, I hadn't run that past Vlad actually. Vlad, you're scouring the comment section. Special thanks to my monthly coffee supporters. You make my life genuinely easier to live, and I appreciate it immensely. If you want to help me make more videos, you can become a monthly coffee supporter yourself over on my coffee page. If you'd be kind enough to like the video and leave a comment, that would greatly help me. And if you want to hear more of my content, subscribe to the channel. That'd be great. Links to everything else I do, including a science fiction podcast and weird horror trap music, is available in the descriptions and stuff. This video was edited by Teo. Go watch his videos at the letter 15. Additional thanks to Roots for helping me tackle some of the dicier sections of this video, to Vlad for showing me all the hot gots of colour on Instagram, and to Hazel for setting up the camera and bringing me cups of tea. And to all 3 for hearing me talk about this video and being there for me to bounce ideas off of for literally months, and just generally for being in my life. I am insanely lucky. I will stop there. Thank you so much for watching. Don't bully me. Bye!